it's like there is an unwritten rule, which is after a bit, I'm going to stop asking you the question because you're not going to answer it, and we're just going to move on, and that's fine. We're both happy. But Jeremy just thought, you know what? I'm not going to. I've had enough. Wait, I don't know. He said I was fed up with the BS. I will say.
Yeah.
He was just fed up at that point. He was just sick and tired of it.
Hello and good afternoon.
Welcome. Good morning. And
hello and welcome.
good morning.
Good afternoon and welcome to On the Record.
How do you feel, Prime Minister, about criticism which has been made in the last few days?
Brian, if anyone's coming over as domineering in this interview, it's you.
With respect, that is not answering the question of whether you threatened to overrule him.
I think most people who have dealt with me think I'm a pretty straight sort of guy, and I am.
A lot of people in this country use prescription painkillers and pills to help them get through. Are you one of those people?
Paragraph 5.
And how would you handle paragraph 5C?
Yeah. Rob Burley was for many years the man responsible for the music at the end of the Andrew Marr show, but don't hold that against him. Aside from orchestrating that awkwardness of cabinet ministers nodding along to the oboe bother of the week, he's had a ringside seat on some of the biggest political interviews for more than a quarter of a century. As well as editing the Andrew Marr show, he's worked with Jeremy Paxman, Andrew Neil, Jonathan Dimbleby, Kirsty Walk, Emily Maitlis, Evan Davis, and now Beth Rigby on Sky News. His new book, Why Is This Lying to Me, takes its title from Paxman's declared approach to interviews. It's a sort of love letter to the political interview, as well as charting his career at ITV, the BBC, and much else besides. And Rob joins me in the studio now. Morning, nice
Hello.
to see you.
How are you?
Oh, very good. Oh, very good. The overall, you're sort of, if there's a manifesto in the book, it's the appeal for a return to the long form political interview.
Yes.
How long does an interview need to be before it becomes long form?
It's a very good question. I think minimum 20 minutes, 22 minutes, but really ideally you'd be talking about 30 minutes or so. Mrs. Thatcher, where she did Weekend World in 1989 for 46 minutes, which is pretty courageous. So maybe that's well, actually let's do 46.
46.
Yeah.
Is there a risk that actually regular long form in political interviews are actually a bit boring?
Well, yeah, there will be occasions when that happens. But the thing is, so if that's the sort of rationale, and probably in TV exec terms, it might be the rationale for not doing them, then we're sort of putting that first above things like democracy, which strike me as more important. So perhaps we should value what you get uniquely from those interviews that you don't get from anything else, whether it's a debate or any other kind of form of accountability.
So what is it that you think you can get from 46 minutes with a politician? Because I suppose if you've got the Prime Minister in the middle of a crisis and you can really drill into the details of it and maybe find out information in before, nobody really wants 46 minutes with the best one in the world, I don't know, Oliver Dowden or Jonathan Reynolds.
Well, the truth is these people, you can always make things seem ridiculous by reference to someone contemporary who seems like a minnow in comparison to the greats of the past, which you just did. So that's not really an argument, it doesn't strike me. I mean, if those are people who are currently or seek to actually run things like, the education system or the NHS or any number, the justice system, these are all really important things in people's lives. And I know it's a bit boring, but, it's actually really important. And I think we're losing a lot by kind of the abandonment of this, really, in most places.
Well, let's go right back to the beginning then. And some of the examples you've picked out in the book. Where you say this is where it all started. This is a clip of Robin Day interviewing the then Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, in February 1958.
How do you feel, Prime Minister, about criticism which has been made in the last few days, in Conservative newspapers particularly, of Mr. Selwyn Lloyd, the Foreign Secretary?
Well, I think Mr. Selwyn Lloyd is a very good Foreign Secretary and has done his work extremely well. If I didn't think so, I would have made a change. I do not intend to make a change simply as a result of pressure. I don't believe that is wise, and it's not in accordance with my idea of loyalty.
Is it correct, as reported in one paper, that he would like, in fact, to give up the job of Foreign Secretary?
Not at all, except in the sense that everybody would like to give up these appalling burdens which we try and carry.
Would you like to give up yours?
In a sense, yes, because they are very heavy burdens. But of course, nobody can pretend that it isn't. We've gone into this game, we try and do our best, and it's both, in a sense, our pleasure and certainly, I hope, our duty.
So that was 1958. It was a few years before he relieved Selwyn Lloyd of his duties at the long nights. Why is that interview so significant for you?
Well, in the first place, it's because, although it sounds incredibly tame now, obviously, to ask about Selwyn Lloyd, the Foreign Secretary's future, was seen as deeply impertinent thing to do. That's not the kind of thing you did in an interview with the Prime Minister. You just didn't. That was newspaper talk. It wasn't something you would have in a broadcast situation. Also, I believe it's 13 minutes. We were talking about length, which was quite a significant length and unusual then. You know, the classic is a sort of grabbed interview at the airport when the Prime Minister lives there.
It's amazing the amount of archive, which is just people arriving, coming and going at airports.
With sort of fairy coats saying, anything you'd like to share with the country, Prime Minister? That's the usual form.
Yeah.
So Robin, well, he wasn't Sir Robin then, but Robin Day invented something new there. Also, I love it because of the supplementary questions about the burdens of office, which I just imagine now someone just saying, if only I could get out of the game.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't say that today. They wouldn't survive it. But so that was great. But and then that was the springboard to Robin Day, becoming the first real forensic political interviewer, and one of the greats still.
Do you think it makes a difference because it was an evolving form, both politician and interviewer, sort of finding their way through the world of telly, as more people got TVs and they got to see and hear from their politicians for the first time? Is that why it's hard to recreate now? Because part of the reason why it was so great, there weren't many channels. Yeah. So if it was on, well, you had to watch it. Also, we were quite keen to hear from politicians. And now there's a sort of slight risk you never stop hearing from them.
True. I mean, that's with the cachet that is less these days. But I mean, it was evolving. I mean, that's one of the things I liked discovering was the manner in which, quite quickly, Harold Wilson a few years later was keen to harness TV. So was Edward Heath, and Edward Heath actually gives a quote talking about essentially being on message in the new Labour style, sort of 30 years before it was invented by Peter Mandelson, we thought.
Yeah.
So they were already thinking quite quickly about how to kind of survive it. Rather than that, what you had there was that moment before the comms guys got involved.
They actually just had a conversation.
Yeah,
he asked a question and he answered it.
Yeah, and it was really interesting. So, yeah, of course, it evolved in a way that's led us to where we are now.
Yeah. I want to talk about Brian Walden, because it's one of the most gripping bits of the book, I thought. Explain, first of all, so Brian Walden was a Labour MP.
Yeah.
Quit the Commons to become the presenter of Weekend World. And the sort of forerunner of really the Sunday shows as we know it now.
Yeah.
But struck up this incredible relationship with Margaret Thatcher, which you wouldn't think, former Labour MP and then TV interviewer.
Well, the important thing to know about him, of course, even though he was a Labour MP, and one that everybody regarded as a star of the future, he's one of those people who's tipped in those sort of magazine articles about future prime ministers that are never right about who the prime minister will be. And he was one of the ones they named, right? Because in the 60s, he was an orator. He's there pretty young in the House of Commons. He's regarded as the next big thing. But internally, he was struggling because even though he joined the Labour Party, he didn't really believe in socialism. He was really a meritocrat. And when he saw Mrs. Thatcher, he became Thatcher curious pretty quickly because he thought, she's speaking my language. She's a grammar school girl. She's an equivalent to me. So he was already sort of sympathetic to her. And then this left field turn that suddenly he's thrust onto television, really with no experience or real rationale for it. And then his first interview on his very first show is with Mrs. Thatcher, who's then the leader of the opposition. And immediately they're sort of simpatico. We were talking about a conversation. It was a conversation, at times in very great detail about policy. But there was a kind of mutual appreciation of intellectual kind of equality.
It was quite could be quite high-minded.
Really
about
high-minded.
Sort of, theory. They talked about faith and motivations and values rather than what you're going to do on Tuesday.
Yeah, I'll do you favour this or yes or no answer. It was so he tapped into that, and it was, of course, it went with the moment. And it's interesting with Thatcher because actually she doesn't just come out there and say we're going to crush the unions.
Yeah.
So in the 70s, her position is evolving, but between interviews, you see that she becomes more bold and makes an argument about what was the dominant issue of the day, which was really the power of the unions and incomes policy and all those questions.
And he interviewed her more than anyone else.
Yeah.
And they became very close.
Yeah.
But then it sort of culminates with this extraordinary interview in 1989. Just to explain where we were in 1989, Lawson had just resigned.
Yes, so he resigned on the Wednesday or Thursday. I always mix that up. I think it's Wednesday night. And then, that's right. And then an interview between Brian Walden and Mrs. Thatcher had already been long planned.
Yeah.
So it was coming up as a pre-recorded. In the diary as a pre-recorded interview at the London studios where on the South Bank where the programme was broadcast from. And there was no question, really, that she was going to go ahead and do it. So in the middle of what was clearly her biggest political crisis, the loss of her kind of anchor there, Nigel Lawson, she went on television for 46 minutes with Brian Walden. But the interesting thing is, as you say, is how close they were. And just rewind very briefly, so close, and this is extraordinary, I think, that back in 1983, in the general election campaign, Mrs. Thatcher's seeking a second term. for lots of reasons. She's very late at night she's a few days before the polling day. She's doing her last election broadcast, and she's not happy with the script. So who do they call? Someone from Saatchi & Saatchi, or maybe some central office? No, they call Brian Walden and see whether he would be willing to come and turn his hand to put to writing the appeal to the country for a second term. And he does it. When on the same day he'd interviewed her on ITV, in Downing Street.
And reading it, you've sort of pieced this together as the research of the book. And it's extraordinary, because today, this is the sort of thing people think would, be outrageous today. Yeah. If you go back 40 years, the flagship political interview of the time sits down with the Prime Minister on the eve of the general election, does an interview, and that night secretly goes to help her out writing her party political forecast.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, and has never actually been substantiated until now. It's been rumoured there's a guy called Ronald Miller, who was a very sort of thespian speechwriter, who wrote the Ladies Not for Turning speech, and he put it in his book in the early 90s. But it was only when I spoke to Charles Moore who told me that Brian confirmed this to him in his conversations they had shortly before his death. So it's mind-blowing. But that's what sets the tone and the context for what happens in 1989.
That's how close they were throughout the 80s.
Yeah.
Throughout the 80s, it was so close that there was an extraordinary conflict of interest. He went and helped Margaret Thatcher write her party political broadcast. We get to 1989. Nigel Lawson's just resigned as Chancellor after falling out with Margaret Thatcher's economic advisor.
Yeah.
Let's take a listen to what happened.
Let me put this to you, Prime Minister. It may be the case that in private you will have a lusty argument and you will listen to other people's opinions, and that you're only too happy to accept a suggestion if it's correct. But you never come over in public like that, ever. You come over as being someone who one of your backbenchers said is slightly off her trolley, authoritarian, domineering, refusing to listen to anybody else. Why? Why cannot you publicly project what you have just told me is your private character?
Brian, if anyone's coming over as domineering in this interview, it's you. It's you.
You think
hammering things out instead of just talking them in a conversational way. Yes, you're very domineering at the moment.
It's extraordinary, that. And it was such an explosive interview. And actually it was born out of frustration on his part, because he kept saying, why is your Chancellor resigned? He said, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And he sort of loses his rag a little bit there, and they never spoke again afterwards.
Yeah, but again, just to rewind a tiny bit, Matt, is that the weekend of that interview, in fact, the morning of it, because it was a pre-record, The Independent wrote a piece all about Brian Walden, saying essentially this is the moment of reckoning for Mrs. Thatcher at her most vulnerable moment, and it falls to essentially a sort of supplicant, a Thatcherite who can't do the job, Brian Walden. So Brian went into that interview having to make a choice between his friendship with her, his ideological sort of, what's the word?
Alliance.
Alliance with her, and his journalistic ethics.
Yeah.
By the way, something he got very badly wrong a few years previously.
Yeah.
And he went in there, he had a choice to make, and he made the choice. And so when she didn't answer the question in the way that she didn't, he wasn't going to let her go.
Do you think it makes a difference that he was a former politician? Because actually that exchange, with a bit of noise in the background, would sound... that could be across the dispatch box almost. There's sort of the heft behind his.
You're right, yeah.
And the way he built the question.
Yeah, there is the oratory there. You can imagine him utilising in the Commons. Yeah, for sure. I think the real frustration that for both of them have in that situation is quite interesting. One is he knows that this version of her that he's presenting, which is the domineering person, which is the great critique at this point. He sort of knows that's not entirely true, because he speaks to her all the time. He's going to Downing Street and having a whiskey with her. Yeah. And she knows that he knows that. And he said, and she says to him, why can't we just have a normal conversation?
Yeah. Why are you being weird?
Yeah, why are you being weird? and then because he was so weird in her terms, it's true, they never spoke again. Yeah. Which is, a sad ending, because they were very close, and, a year later she's gone.
Yeah. Let's jump ahead, because there's a lot of history to get through. Let's jump ahead to Tony Blair.
Yeah.
And you've written, there's a lot in the book about how he used interviews to take on his critics over Iraq. And actually that sort of, although people criticised the sort of new Labour spin machine, Blair did put himself out there a lot.
Yes.
Not long after he became Prime Minister, the Bernie Ecclestone affair blew up. What donations have Bernie Ecclestone given to the Labour Party, and the rules around advertising for Formula One. And he invites John Humphreys to Chequers for a 45-minute interview. But this is back in 1997. Let's take a listen to this. This is from On the Record.
You've been in power for 6 months and a bit now, and you've had a quite extraordinary period in office. I mean, you have been the most popular Prime Minister since ever. Now the papers are saying that the issue surrounding you is one of trust. Do you believe that as a result of what has happened in this past week or so, you have lost the trust of the British people?
No, I don't believe that. And I hope that people know me well enough and realise the type of person I am to realise that I would never do anything either to harm the country or anything proper. I never have. I think most people who have dealt with me think I'm a pretty straight sort of guy, and I am.
A defining quote which hung around his neck for such a long time, pretty straight kind of guy. Did something change in the long-form political interview in those new Labour years, or is that people trying to pin something on Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell that's a bit unfair?
Well, they were successful in changing it, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, like you said, they put themselves out there.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, and Alistair Campbell's attitude to that moment was, we can't go on Frost, which, by the way, Blair would rather have done, because David Frost would have been a more comfortable ride. We have to take a kicking, he thought, from John Humphreys on the record.
That's interesting.
So they went and did that for that reason. He has to be seen to take a kicking. What really fascinates me about that interview, actually, is the effectiveness of that line. Because the country wasn't ready for him not to be a straight kind of guy.
Yeah.
He'd just been elected after all the sleaze of the Tory years. We'd had 18 years of Tory government. It was like this the new dawn had broken, had it not. The last thing people really wanted to believe that soon after was that he's just like all the rest of them.
Yeah.
They still wanted to believe that it was a fresh face and that he was going to do things differently, despite the evidence that around, without going into all the detail, he was kind of banged to rights on that question about covering up when they were doing this, that, and the other around the story. But he kind of got away with it because everyone wanted him to get away with it.
Yeah, and it's a soundbite which rang true to the public's mind at the time.
At that time.
And in fact, the title of the book comes from something that Jeremy Paxman once said, although he said he was quoting someone else and he insisted he didn't always approach every interview like that. But let's take a listen, Rob, to one of Jeremy Paxman's most famous interviews with Michael Howard in 1997.
It's a quick, straight yes or no question, and I will give you an answer. Did you threaten to overrule him?
I discussed this matter with Derek Lewis. I gave him the benefit of my opinion. I gave him the benefit of my opinion in strong language. But I did not instruct him because I was not entitled to instruct him. I was entitled to express my opinion, and that is what I did.
With respect, that is not answering the question of whether you threatened to overrule him.
And on it went 14 times. Did you threaten to overrule him? This week we've had a bit of asking Keir Starmer, would you go into coalition with the Lib Dems 6 times in one interview, 7 times in another interview? Is there a right number of times to ask the same question?
That's good. That's a good question. I mean, actually, Andrew Neil says it's 3.
3's enough.
Yeah, 3's enough. By that point, you've established they're not going to answer it. I think Jeremy had probably adhered to that unwritten rule. And what I love about that interview is that with Howard, is that it's like there is an unwritten rule, which is after a bit, I'm going to stop asking you the question because you're not going to answer it, and we're just going to move on, and that's fine. We're both happy. But Jeremy just thought, you know what? I'm not going to, I've had enough. Wait, I don't know. He said I was fed up with the BS, I will say.
Yeah.
He was just fed up at that point. He was just sick and tired of it. He's often said, I carried on doing the questions because the next item wasn't ready or something like that, which is not true. It was. If you watch it, it doesn't make any sense as a reason. He just was sick of it.
Yeah.
And he decided that rather than play the game, he would do that. And Howard was apparently livid afterwards and understood how damaging it was.
And I suppose there is a subtle difference between the would you go into coalition, because Keir Starmer can rightly say, well, I'm focusing on a majority. Yeah. That was on a question of fact. Did you threaten to overrule him?
Yeah.
I didn't overrule him. Yeah, but did you threaten to overrule? I didn't overrule him. Even though the details of what all that was about is sort of lost to history, the moment that Michael Howard, and it haunted him, and then even when he came back as Tory leader. Let's hear from a slightly. This was an interview you worked on with Jeremy Paxman. Yeah. Explain what it was like going into Jeremy Paxman. You were working at Newsnight as a producer.
Yeah.
You've got to go and tell Jeremy Paxman that he's going to interview Russell Brand.
He wasn't very pleased about it, Matt. His question was just Russell who, and then why? And then I made a stab at this when I said, he's written a piece in the New Statesman. Has he? Is it any good? Well, he's quite popular with younger audiences. Is he?
And he was a sort of political thing in 2013. He then went on to interview Ed Miliband at the 2015 election. Let's just take a listen to Jeremy Paxman's encounter with Russell Brand.
You've spent your whole career berating and haranguing politicians, and then when, like me, a comedian goes, yeah, they're all worthless, what's the point in engaging with any of them? You sort of have a go at me, because I'm not poor anymore. Well,
No, I'm not
sorry.
having a go at you about that. I'm just asking you, why we should take you seriously when you're so unspecific?
Why wouldn't I be facetious? Why would I take it seriously? Why would I encourage a constituency of young people that are absolutely indifferent to vote? Why would we? Aren't you bored? Aren't you more bored than anyone? Ain't you been talking to them year after year, listening to their lies, their nonsense?
And on he went. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing about that is that Russell Brand's not playing by the rules of a Newsnight interview.
No. Well, he's not a politician. He's got nothing. He's got nothing to offer in concrete terms. No real solutions. His argument would be that I'm just the person saying fire in a theatre. There is a fire, and so I don't necessarily have all the answers about that. But I'm saying it. But it's interesting because Jeremy ends up in a weird position in that interview because he sort of ends up being an advocate for the sort of establishment. And he asks him to sort of have a plan and to sort of engage and vote. And actually, to be honest, Brand does quite well. Brand, who's I think I say in the book he was flirting with the conspiracy theory, and at that
he's
time
gone full on since.
He's since sort of consummated that. So that's what he's like. But it was an interesting moment. But I mean, the amazing thing is 12 million people watched it on YouTube.
Wow.
So
and that was quite 2013. That was quite early for that sort of Newsnight thing going viral.
Yeah, and Ian Katz, the editor at the time, very much wanted to do it. Jeremy, as I said, was very sceptical, but I guess it sort of was vindicated because people wanted to hear someone who actually expressed an opinion, wasn't tramlined.
It is part of the problem with the political interview now, and particularly, let's move on. We'll do Boris Johnson in a sec. Boris Johnson is a bit like Russell Brand in that he doesn't play by the rules of the interview. If you just, if you just say, well, I'm just going to talk about something else, or I'm going to make a joke, or I'm going to just undermine the entire premise of this, unless both sides are taking part in the same sport.
Yeah.
If the interview is playing tennis and you just start waving around a hockey stick, well, then the whole thing sort of falls apart.
Yeah, but it's your stadium, right?
Yeah.
It's
even more complicated sporting principle.
I know, but you need to pull it back. And actually, I don't know if you're going to play a clip from that interview.
Yeah, let's have a listen to this. Is Andrew Neil interviewing Boris Johnson during the 2019 Tory leadership contest.
So how would you handle? You talk about Article 5B. In
paragraph 5.
24.
Article 24. Get the detail right.
5,
Get the detail right, Andrew. It's Article 24, paragraph 5.
And how would you handle paragraph 5C?
I would confide entirely in paragraph 5B because that is.
But how would you get round what's in 5C?
I would confide entirely in paragraph 5B, which is
Do you know what's
enough
in 5C?
for our purposes. No.
I thought you were a man of detail.
And that was Boris Johnson thought he'd got one over on Andrew Neil by talking about paragraph 5B in the Brexit negotiations. And for a moment it looked like he had, but Andrew Neil also knew what was in 5C, and Boris Johnson didn't.
Absolutely. So when this was all planned, obviously, to try and stop him doing what you describe, by taking him somewhere that he thought he wanted to go. Because when he saw 5B there ahead of him, he thought, oh, that's a lovely thing. I like going towards 5B because I know about 5B. So we'd already thought, well, he's never going to know what 5C is. So if we can get him down the road to 5B, the worst that can happen is he knows what 5C is. That's unlikely. So that was the plan, and he not only did he do it, but he did it with extraordinary hubris. Get the detail right, Andrew. Andrew Neil being told to get the detail right by Boris Johnson is something.
But isn't that a sort of a gotcha moment?
No.
It's just trying to make Boris Johnson look silly
rather
than any way help, because the viewer or listener doesn't know what 5B or 5C is.
No, because he was regularly using this what sounded like an impressive technical grasp to say that it will be fine if there's a no deal Brexit. Okay. Yeah. Pretty significant question that matters to people. And so to avoid actual engagement in reality, he had a set answer that he thought he could deploy. So of course, it's a joyous moment of gotcha, I suppose, but actually it's a substantive point, which is, if you're presenting to me the idea that you're a prime minister who grasps detail and knows what's happening with the GATT agreement, and that's why we can trust you to be the prime minister, then you're pulling the wool over our eyes, and that's revealed on that clip.
One thing I thought, reading the book, and it was fascinating, the sort of evolution of the interviewer and the interviewee, is that actually the long-form political interview does exist today, but it's in podcasts. It's Matt Ford doing, the what's it called, the political party, or Nick Robinson, or Past Imperfect. But there's sort of that actually TV has become aggressive and in the constant grinding out of news lines. It actually becomes much less informative. But weirdly, podcasts have become the place where the long-form political interview lives.
Yeah, well, they're not. Although the tone is very different, isn't it? There's not much jeopardy there. It's very much a kind of a gentle chat. But no, I agree on that. I think that's a really heartening thing, which suggests to me that people like depth. Actually, they don't just want superficial stuff. And of course, it's all a bit self-fulfilling because if you have short interviews that don't happen as often because politicians don't make themselves available, then people want to try and be Jeremy Paxman in 7 minutes on the news channel, you know, whatever, and then it just becomes a kind of spectacle. They're not a very good one. So, you know, what we need to do is on television, return to that. Look, it's maybe a forlorn attempt, right? We need to return on television to long-form political interviewing because it's the best way of establishing the credibility and the character of the people that want to rule us.
Finally, then, I mentioned at the beginning that you were responsible for the awkward music at the end of Andrew Mars.
You say awkward.
Was there ever anything you put on which you wish you hadn't in that musical slot?
In the musical slot? No, they were all great.
You all thought they were great?
Yeah.
So what we thought we'd do is we play out this chat.
Is it the Wurzels?
No, it's not the Wurzels. This is a flautist, which is about the most ridiculous thing we thought we could play out with. So in keeping with your time on the Andrew Mars Show, Rob Burley, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, man.
Right, that is enough of that. That was Rob Burley, and his new book is called Why Is This Lying to Me? It's out today.
It's out today.
Out
you
today.
can buy it, yeah.
In all good bookshops.
Yeah.
And you can listen to this music. This is the flautist Herbert Laws and his band live at the Los Angeles Public Library.
Should have booked this guy.
Oh, there's a bit of fiddle now, isn't there? This is very Andrew Marr. You can picture like David Liddington sitting, Emily Thornberry sitting awkwardly on the sofa. That's lovely. Rob, lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Rob Burley there.